Thanks for joining me on YouTube. Of course, some interesting times right now we're going through, and a lot of folks want to talk about some heavy topics. Ariana with Nationwide Children's Hospital here to join us now.
Nope.
Ariana?
I'm with Ohio State.
Oh, with Ohio State. Sorry about that. With Ohio State. I was told you were with Nationwide Children's Hospital with Ohio State. Ariana Gallagher with Ohio State joining me now to kind of talk about some of these heady topics. And obviously, typically we would have a shorter interview, but with a topic like this, we don't want to talk about the traditional way of handling things. We really want to have a long-form discussion about a lot of this stuff. And with so many acts, obviously, now of political violence, just this year, kids are pretty curious by nature, and adults obviously like to process these things to help their kids out. Difficult. When you're talking about something like Charlie Kirk and what happened to him yesterday, how real can you get when you're talking to kids about things like this?
You know, I think it really depends on how much information kids already have about what happened. You know, I don't think it makes sense to completely shield them because, you know, kids are going to be talking amongst themselves. So whatever we can do to stay factual and to sort of affect label. So be able to say, yeah, what happened is really sad, and invite kids to share about how they're feeling, what their reactions are. Engage in a dialogue that's based on feelings instead of getting too far into the weeds about the why behind it all.
And from a parent's perspective, I mean, can you kind of tell your kids what you're going through? I mean, kind of what you're feeling to kind of help them process as well.
I think anytime we can model healthy processing of emotions, it makes sense to do that. So being able to say, you know what, I feel really sad when things like this happen in the world too. And then talk about, you know, what are some things that we can do when we feel sad?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, when things like this happen, you know, working with, you know, kids and adults, a professional like yourself, I mean, how do you handle this stuff and kind of process it as you process it to kind of help those families out as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think putting things into the proper perspective is always the greatest challenge. You know, if we drill down on what are the drivers of more extreme emotional responses, extreme emotions are really driven by extreme thoughts and beliefs. So whatever we can do to be really intentional about how we frame what's going on in the world and recognize that there's nuance everywhere. We don't have to go to that all or nothing place. All or nothing tends to lead to really more intense emotions that are harder to manage. So what can I do to recognize that this is a tragedy, it's very sad, and there are still things that we have to take care of throughout our day. So what can I do to feel my feelings, set aside time for that, create space for that, and then intentionally shift to what's something that might be a little bit low-hanging that I can take care of and get off the to-do list and sort of re-engage with life.
Mm-hmm. And Ariana, a lot of folks are watching us on YouTube right now. We kind of put out the call on Facebook and Instagram and some of our social media questions that folks had, and they really had some great questions. So I want to give you, you know, some of the questions that we got from our viewers. And in particular, when it comes to Charlie Kirk, he made it his business, of course, to be on college campuses. So he was a well-known figure among many of those young people. What do you say to kids, who liked him, who are going through this, but also those kids who may not have been fans, but they're still processing this as well?
Absolutely. I think whatever we can do to lean into our common humanity whenever there are acts of violence, it doesn't really matter the who. It's more about, you know, what are we doing to make sure that everyone feels safe? And what are we doing to make sure that those who are impacted have resources and support to be able to process through that? So you liked him, you didn't like him. There are lots of different, you know, examples in our world today where you might agree with something or not agree with something. It's really about how are we going to, as a society, take care of each other when we're going through difficult times.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about that video as well, because that's been kind of hard, obviously, with you know, social media and the internet. It's been pretty, you know, easy to actually see the actual video of this, you know, going on, and kids are, you know, sharing this video, seeing this video. How do you kind of work with them with that when they see something so violent and real? You know, you may see it in a video game or in a movie, but this is real life we're talking about.
Yeah. I think being really clear with kids, and when we say kids, I think we need to be specific about, you know, age ranges. How you talk to a 7-year-old is going to be a lot different than how you talk to a 17-year-old about things like this. So there's a large span there in terms of being age appropriate when you're having these conversations. But being able to recognize that violence is not the way that we want to conduct ourselves in our world. And so you may see some of this violence. Let's invite discussion about how you're reacting to what you saw, and then engage in a dialogue about, you know, what can you do to add something positive to the world? And restoring some of that sense of agency with our kids. Because a lot of times things like this lead folks to feel a little bit helpless and overwhelmed. So what can we do to restore a sense of control and agency in situations where maybe we didn't have control over what happened? We can only look to the future. What can I do? What's my part in making the world a better place?
And speaking of kind of making the world a better place and those decisions, when it comes to kids, obviously a lot of kids may, you know, share this video via social media, via text. How do you kind of explain to them that they shouldn't be doing that this is wrong, this may be adding to someone's, you know, trauma or someone's stress?
I think talking to kids about boundaries is really important. And again, sort of modeling that empathy. You know, if the shoe were on the other foot and this was someone that you personally knew and cared about, you know, would you want a bunch of people sharing it and making comments about it? And so if you wouldn't want that done to you, then maybe that's not behavior to engage in. So really whatever we can do to help model that empathy and teach people how to make those decisions, I think is going to be value added to the world.
And, you know, speaking of that, we're kind of in a very highly charged political time right now. And a lot of that is going back and forth on social media. A lot of folks, you know, putting their opinions on social media and going back and forth. And sometimes there can be false information. When you're talking to a kid or a young person, be it, you know, high school, college, how do you kind of help them decipher and kind of filter out that information to make sure that they're getting, you know, not only factual information, but information that is not necessarily weighing heavily on them mentally?
Yeah. Well, critical thinking is a skill that can be developed. And so when a kid comes to you with like, can you believe what I heard? I think the first step is to say, tell me more. Tell me more, and what do you think about that? And does that sound right to you? And have you checked that out? You know, where's that coming from? So being able to ask some questions and engage in a dialogue so that you're not just shutting down the conversation, but you're inviting that child to think critically about the information that they're taking in. I think that's really a good first step.
And when you talk about times like this and so many things that are coming at folks a million miles an hour on social media, on the media, you know, be it, you know, television, social media apps, can folks experience PTSD when they're dealing with something like this? And if so, what are some of those signs?
Well, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder comes with some very distinct symptoms. And when we talk about PTSD, I think sometimes in broader society we use it as sort of a catch-all, when really we're talking about a spectrum here. So we start on one end where there's stress, and certainly it can be stressful to take in this kind of content. And then kind of in the middle here, just on the edge of our ability to cope, is crisis, where someone's feeling really overwhelmed by what they're taking in. They may not have the resources they need to cope. And then all the way over here on the other end of the spectrum is post-traumatic stress disorder. And with PTSD, we're really looking at a longitudinal constellation of symptoms. So it's not something that you see something today and tomorrow you're diagnosed with PTSD. But as these symptoms linger over time, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts, lots of high emotional responses, noticing that you're starting to avoid people, places, things that remind you of the situation, having a heightened startle response, getting really irritable, taking risks that you wouldn't normally take. These are some of the things that we look for in terms of screening for PTSD. Now, some of those symptoms can be present in the short-term aftermath of taking in something that's incredibly stressful or may lead you to a crisis point. But really, those are natural reactions that tend to resolve within the first week or so. So we don't want to overly pathologize people, but we do want to take seriously the impact of stress and crisis on a person. So we want to really be thoughtful about creating space for people to process their feelings, be able to get support to maybe pace themselves a little bit differently as they're acclimating to the new normal, and really coming to terms with, what just happened and what does it mean.
And obviously, with all of the news yesterday with Charlie Kirk, it can't be overshadowed that there was actually a school shooting where 3 kids were shot near Denver, Colorado. How do you talk kids through something like that? I mean, just so much trauma, and then this may hit really close to home for a lot of those kids, especially maybe in middle school and high school.
Yeah. I think having conversations about safety and what helps kids feel safe is a good starting point. Being able to recognize that, some of the places that folks go to every day and are asked to pay attention, there may be some hypervigilance following an event like a school shooting. There may be folks kind of looking over their shoulder, wondering if their school is safe. And so being able to create space for kids to be able to talk about those fears so that we can provide some reassurance and comfort and help kids think through, how do they want to contribute to making school a safe learning environment for everybody. And if you are worried about somebody, what do? Who do you tell? So kind of coaching kids around how to, sound the alarm if they're concerned that somebody's not maybe in the best headspace and may even perpetrate violence. So again, sort of restoring that sense of there's something I can do to contribute to safety in my school.
How do you know as a parent if you're, pushing too hard? Maybe, you're feeling a certain way, so you think your kids are feeling a certain way and you're questioning them and maybe you're putting more stress on them maybe than they even have. How do you know as a parent that you're pushing a little bit too much?
That's a great question. I think whatever we can do to start the conversation with open-ended questions with our kids and then follow their lead, being able to invite them to share about that, how they're feeling. And if they're not showing any particular signs of stress or distress, we can leave it there. So we don't have to over-explain or, check. Let's follow their lead, but you start with some open-ended questions that kind of lets you get the lay of the land.
And just the last thing I have for you, for those parents or families who may be out there watching us on YouTube, what sort of resources are out there if they have these questions that they want to maybe research themselves and kind of, how do I attack this? What sort of resources are out there for folks?
There are really wonderful resources here locally. You mentioned Nationwide Children's. They have lots of really robust, wonderful programming to support kids who are stressed out, perhaps experiencing mental health concerns. In particular, the Center for Family Safety and Healing has a lot of really great resources around how to talk to kids about, exposure to violence. And I think really starting from a place of emotional literacy is important. So whatever you can do as a parent or an adult or a support person in a kid's life to get situated yourself around being able to talk about emotions. And what do we do when we feel mad? And what do we do when we feel sad? And what do we do when we feel overwhelmed? Being able to have those conversations and not shy away from them, that's going to be a game changer for a lot of kids.
All right, Ariana Gallagher with Ohio State. Thank you for joining us. And again, great conversation, great information, and I'm sure a lot of parents and families got a lot out of that. And a lot of folks going through a lot, so we're definitely trying to help them out with any sort of mental situation.
Happy to help.
All right, thank you, and thank you for watching us on YouTube.